welcome to today's webinar, which is being presented by the Rose Project of Jewish Federation of Orange County. The subject of today's webinar, the Israeli-UAE peace agreement announced 1 week ago, constitutes an historic event in Israel's history and a significant breakthrough in the region. The event has garnered a tremendous amount of interest worldwide. It has also generated many important questions as we seek to understand the implications of this agreement for Israel, the Middle East, and for our hopes for peace in the region. We're honored to explore this issue and to begin to answer our many questions with two of the leading experts on Middle East diplomacy and the US-Israel relationship, both of whom have been deeply involved in peace efforts throughout their illustrious careers. And now I'm delighted to introduce our speakers, though I know for many of you, they need no introduction. The Rose Project has had the honor of hosting both Ambassador Ross and David Makovsky here in Orange County in the past, and we're thrilled to host you again today, even if it's only virtually. Our speakers have very long and illustrious biographies, which I'm fairly confident this audience knows well. Ambassador Dennis Ross played a leading role in shaping US involvement in the Middle East peace process on behalf of Presidents George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama. He is the author of 5 books on the peace process, the Middle East and international relations, including Be Strong and of Good Courage, How Israel's Most Important Leaders Shaped Its Destiny, which he co-wrote with David Makovsky. David Makovsky, our second guest, has served as senior advisor to the Special Envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations at the US Department of State, and has authored hundreds of articles on this topic. His popular podcast, Decision Points, highlights big moments in Israel's history, as well as contemporary topics. Both of our guests work with the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, a leading think tank on these issues. So, Ambassador Ross, I'm going to open the conversation with you. Thank you for being here. And I'm going to ask you a question related to your op-ed in the Washington Post this past Thursday. In that piece, you described the Israel-UAE development as an important contribution to peace building between Arabs and Israelis. Can you share with us what happened? What's the nature of this agreement? How did it come about? And what might it mean for Israel, the Palestinians, and the region?
Well, first, thanks for having both David and me. We're thrilled to be with you and to be able to talk about, as we said before we went on, to talk about a good news story as it relates to the Middle East. That's highly unusual. Let me give you a little bit of the backstory to how and why this agreement emerged. You really have to go back to the Trump peace plan when it was announced at the end of January. At that time, Prime Minister Netanyahu, who was also running in an election, in advance of the election, made it very clear that he intended to go ahead and unilaterally annex those areas that were allotted to Israel in the Trump peace plan. That's 30%, roughly 30% of the West Bank, 130 settlements, all 130 settlements, and the Jordan Valley. What we saw was a kind of flurry of activity, including by people like David and me together in terms of what we were conveying privately, but also publicly, that if you wanted this plan to have any chance at all, you were going to see it was going to be preempted. It would be dead on arrival the minute that annexation went ahead. So I think what emerged within the White House, especially with Jared Kushner, was a recognition that if the plan was to have any hope at all, unilateral annexation could not take place. He very quickly began to talk about the need to have a joint committee between the United States and Israel. The purpose of that joint committee was to take what was a conceptual map that was offered in the plan and then turn it into something that would be very practical. And he said it would take months to work that out. That was kind of the first step back. Now he added on to that by then saying nothing should really be done prior to the Israeli election. After the Israeli election, when it took a while to form a government, and that government had blue in it as well as they could, meaning in addition to Prime Minister Netanyahu, you also had Benny Gantz and Gabi Ashkenazi, who were the head of the Blue-White Party. As they began to convey a hesitancy on moving ahead with unilateral annexation, partly because they were worried about the impact on Egypt and Jordan, partly because they felt there should be at least some discussions with the Palestinians, partly because there was a question of, is this the time to be focused on this when we're having to deal with COVID? We formed the government on the basis of dealing with this emergency. So they put out what amounted to kind of a blinking yellow light. They embraced the Trump plan, but by the way, they embraced all the Trump plan, which meant a Palestinian state. It meant a swap of territory. And there were those around Prime Minister Netanyahu within Likud who did not embrace all of the Trump plan, who said they were dead set against two states, and who basically focused exclusively on the issue of annexation. One thing the administration had said is this is a holistic plan. It's not a plan for annexation. So you have a context where there's already a kind of hesitancy on the part of the White House based on what they're hearing from the Arabs in general. Then they see that there's not consensus within the Israeli government. So the message was to the Israeli government, the new Israeli government, you need to reach a consensus. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu had wanted to push ahead. He wanted by July 1 to move on the issue of annexation, on extending Israeli sovereignty. And what happened in this period is that a number of the Arab states began to go to the White House and emphasize even more that there would be a real blowback, real consequences. I think in the case of the UAE, they were raising the consequences of Iran and Turkey exploiting the annexation as a way of putting countries like the UAE and other American friends on the defensive, trying to exploit annexation in terms of fostering and pushing their regional goals. And this, I think, added to the sense on the part of the administration that, maybe again, something should be worked out. Now, I won't go through all the details, but I'll just sort of wrap this up in the following way. There had been a discussion prior to the plan of 4 Arab states, small Arab states, the UAE, Oman, Bahrain, and Qatar. They were in discussions with the White House on a possible treaty of non-belligerency with Israel. They basically walked that back after the Trump peace plan. The UAE, by early July, was making it clear, again, not only that annexation was a problem, but that they were prepared to offer normalization in return for annexation. I'll just flag for you, you had an article by the UAE ambassador, Yusuf Al-Otaiba, who's also the Minister of State, in Yehidiot Haronot, in which he said there are real opportunities for progress in the region with Israel, but you can't have normalization if you have annexation. You can have one or the other, but not both. Initially, he didn't do much more than that, but in the aftermath of that, he did come to the White House and he did propose a readiness to do normalization in return for no annexation, and also in return for the UAE being able to come back and no longer be limited the same way it has been historically by what's known as the qualitative military edge provisions. Going back to the 1980s, we adopted a position that because Israel would always be outnumbered by Arab militaries, it had to maintain a qualitative military edge. Now, that meant not just the quality of its military forces in terms of personnel and people, it also meant that the quality of their weapons. What was also programmed in at that time was a basic calculus that any Arab state that makes peace with Israel will not be subjected to the same limitations that those who have not, but who might be American partners. So part of the deal was that the UAE would be able to request, and the administration would be responsive on weapons that they have sought for some time. I know there's a lot of discussion of the F-35, which is a stealth aircraft, but there's also the question of advanced drones, advanced UAVs that have a strike capability. These have not been available to the UAE. And the logic, just to reinforce the message, any country that made peace with Israel, given a lot of the rejectionists in the region, was bound to be exposed to new threats. So if you're going to make peace with Israel, it is only logical and natural that you should also have access to weapon systems that might improve your own capabilities. The Iranians yesterday detained a UAE ship. They have been making threats towards them. I know from discussions with the Emirati officials that they anticipated the blowback from Iran, but they also are counting on what they think will be the commitment that they have from the United States on being responsive to weapons requests that they make. You may have seen the lead article in the New York Times today had a story on that. And I can just say, I know that this was a core of the deal. Whether the White House shared that with Prime Minister Netanyahu, who says he knows nothing about it, that's a different issue. But what's very clear is that this was a core of the deal. And I know that not theoretically, I know it in very real terms. So why don't I pause there?
Okay, thank you. So I want to ask you one follow-up question, and then we'll turn to David. Can you tell us a little bit about the UAE? In other words, why DAFCA the UAE to be the first, hopefully of more, Arab states to enter into a peace treaty at this stage with Israel? What made this deal possible?
Well, I think the precipitating event, because that was what you first asked, was clearly the issue of annexation. If there wasn't a push for annexation, I don't believe the UAE at this point would have gone ahead and normalized. It was a push for annexation that pushed them to do this, and a fear of two things. One, it would mean the end of a two-state possibility, and two, there would be blowback in the region against it, and they would be put on the defensive. Now, again, it didn't emerge out of the ether. There has been a relationship, a quiet relationship in some respects that had some visibility between the UAE and Israel for some time. It began in the way David likes to talk about it being below the table, I like to talk about it being in the shadows. It began with a focus much more on security issues. But I will tell you, over the last several years, precisely because the UAE is the one country in the region at this point that 10 years ago made a determination that they were going to diversify their economy, reduce their dependence on oil, become a leader in environmental sustainability and alternative energy sources. This is a country that has put a premium on moving towards a digitally based economy, a technologically driven economy. So there has been an interest even below the table, as they would have put it, even below the table in pursuing that. There are large numbers of Israeli companies, I number 500, that are active throughout the Gulf, but not on their Israeli passports. Everybody who's working with them knows where they come from, but they don't travel on their Israeli passports. That, of course, will change now. I mention this because there already was a quiet evolution taking place. It needed a precipitating event, a trigger, to give the Emirati leadership a reason to take what was, from their standpoint, pretty practical cooperation, including in the economic area, including allowing the Israelis to have a diplomatic post in Abu Dhabi, not as a representative to the Emirates, but they had an office in what is known as the International Renewable Energy Agency. Again, symptomatic of the Emirates wanting to be in the forefront of dealing with alternative energy sources and the promotion of those. It's an international agency, and they accepted that Israel would have a diplomatic presence there. So now, you have a kind of context for this, but you still needed a driver, a precipitating event, because from the UAE standpoint, prior to the Trump plan, prior to what looked to be the move towards unilateral annexation, there was a comfort level in the relationship. They were getting a lot of what they needed, security stuff they were getting. I do think they realize, and this is maybe my last point on this, they do perceive the U.S. as being inclined to withdraw more from the region. And if that's going to be the case, that gives them even more of an incentive to be more capable on their own when it comes to their defense. That was, I think, an additional argument for why they wanted to have the limitations, the QME limitations, eased when it comes to them. So you have a number of factors that come together. There is a legacy here, but I do think it was annexation that was the trigger for getting them to cross the threshold that they hadn't previously been prepared to cross.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, David, I'm going to turn to you now. You wrote a piece this week about the role of U.S. diplomacy in forging this deal. Would you take us through that process and share the lessons learned regarding the role of the U.S. in the Middle East?
Okay, thank you, Lisa, and it's great to be with people in Orange County and around the United States. for what is really good news. I always say that often we talk about these issues and I feel you ruin people's days. So, but I hope we're not ruining your day by saying good news. This might be the best news that's happened to Israel in years. Because in philosophically, you're talking about, you pick up where Dennis left off there for a second, if I could just add, you're talking to two countries who see the region in very similar ways. That both Israel and the Emirates are very concerned about Iran's growing presence in the Middle East and would like to curb that influence. The Emirates people are very careful on the record to say this is not against anyone. But I was speaking at a conference in Abu Dhabi in November, and I was just struck how if you close your eyes talking to Emirati officials, you don't know if you're talking to Israelis or Emiratis. They see things very similarly when it comes to their concern about Iranian influence, their worries about jihadis and ISIS and the role of militant groups that could be destabilizing factors in the Middle East. It is really remarkable to see this strategic convergence emerge. And I really think the normalization is an outgrowth. And Dennis is right about the immediate catalyst, but it comes against the wider context. And it is that context of seeing the region very similarly. And I would add, Dennis noted the fact of they don't know if the U.S. is going to stay in the Middle East. I'll just tell one story that really struck me. One senior Emirati said to me, David, we don't know if America is going to stay in the Middle East. The president just said he was going to pull out of Syria and from the Kurdish areas where the Kurds had helped fight the U.S. against ISIS. But we don't know what America is going to do. We know there's one country that can't leave the Middle East because it lives in the Middle East. That's Israel. We can count on Israel. And I really think that was, really was important in that sense of convergence, especially if you feel that people in the U.S. are saying, well, we're becoming more energy sufficient. Maybe we don't need the Middle East. Maybe we don't need that presence in the Middle East. So that's going to be heard. When you talk like that, people are going to hear you. And that is going to draw countries who are more like-minded closer. And just on the technology piece, too, I'll just add, it's hard maybe for American Jews to really absorb this, but they have a sovereign wealth fund of over $1 trillion. And that $1 trillion is something that invests in high-tech startups and other things around the world. And it's something that I think that has seismic potential for Israel. And I think that's really important to see. I see we have some slides here. Just they have launched a mission to Mars. They're one of the top oil producers. Their per capita income is around the same as Israel. But maybe in terms of purchasing power, it's higher than Israel. Israel's also over $400 billion GDP, and its GDP per capita is over $40,000. So this is, and for Israel, this is also, I think, what's in it for Israel. I was on a call with Anwar Gargash. I think we have that slide of, the Minister of State, where he said, look, we want a warm peace with Israel. He started going through all the areas that he thought we can, as the Emirates, he said, technology, medicine, agribusiness, finance, high tech, tourism. This is someone who has, I think, a PhD from Georgetown, I believe. It's like a technological company, a technological focused country that's very similar to Israel. And so I think the convergence here are remarkable. And I think to your question, Lisa, what do we learn from this is I think, that ultimately every peace deal in the Middle East the United States is going to be central. Everything that looks to you and me as a two-way deal is actually a three-way deal. It's just maybe not written in the newspapers as a three-way deal. But if you look at this, when there was an Egypt-Israel peace, suddenly there was sales to Egypt. So Egypt could feel more secure of its threats. When Israel, that was in the late 70s, when Israel did the peace treaty with Jordan in 1994, and Jordan was not in America's good graces because of the Gulf War, and Jordan kind of being more neutral in that war. Suddenly then F-16s went there. And here too, as Dennis pointed out correctly, There's issues about restrictions on arms sales. Now, in the case of the Emirates, unlike the other two cases, they don't share a border with Israel, and they never fought Israel on the battlefield. So you don't have any of the psychological scars of having fought on the battlefield together. I felt just visiting there that there was a very welcome attitude. So I don't want to make it too rosy. It's the Middle East. I always think nothing is linear. There's always going to be curveballs. Things are never so simple. But I'm just struck by how excited people are on both sides. I saw polling data in Israel. 77% of Israelis said that even if they had to choose between this and annexation, they would choose this peace deal with the Emirates. Even the most right-wing cabinet ministers who were a woman named Ayelet Shaked, she said, well, I don't think we should pay in the coinage of annexation. And Bibi said, this is really not up to us. It was up to America because we can't annex if America doesn't recognize. But she said it's fantastic for Israel. So it's this rare good news that from far right to far left, there is this convergence. I'm sure maybe you'll ask us or whatever, but on the Palestinian issue, I think you should use that. Not Palestinians are upset about it because they think it's a bypass road around them. I think it's a bridge that with all the Emirates' resources and capabilities, they can use their services to really facilitate economic progress. I can tell you Sheikh Zayed, the father of MBZ, there's a whole neighborhood in Gaza named after him that the Emiratis gave. And I think that once the Palestinians get over their shock, they should see this not to curse the Emiratis, but to coax the Emiratis to get them more engaged. And they want to. We've seen this with Egypt and Jordan, by the way. That's another lesson that we've seen in the past, is that whenever these countries make peace with Israel, instead of being less interested, they become more interested. They don't want to be the only ones who make peace. They want to widen that circle. They don't want to be isolated. Now here you might have a tipping point because if the Bahrainis and the Omanis and some others do things, then it tips. I think the timing for these countries, also the lesson is timing is everything, just like it is in many things in life. And I'll just say 2 points and then I'll stop. Why the timing is so important. The timing is important because these guys, because they're very aware it's a three-way deal. Israel's thrilled with the normalization, all the unbelievable benefits ahead. But the Emiratis feel, look, we've wanted these relaxations for a while. Gargash said we've talked about the F-35 for 6 years. But when you're facing a presidential election where the president is fighting the battle of his life, you love Trump, you hate Trump, that's not the point. Just as a fair-minded analyst looking at it, when you're facing an uphill election, the polls are against you, you're given this diplomatic achievement, then clearly you want to make it happen. You're not going to let this fall away. So I think the Emiratis feel this is the time, whatever they could gain bilaterally for the U.S., there's a kind of now or never moment. And also I think for some of these Gulf states, including the Emirates, they have to look ahead. Again, whether you like Trump or not like Trump, that's not my business here to talk about in this session. But if you have to be responsible and look, well, what about a post-Trump period? And here, I think for the Emiratis, it's trying to purchase what I would call political risk insurance. If you feel that you're in a post-Trump period, maybe the priorities of a new administration might be different. Maybe it fears, well, we're going to revive the Iranian nuclear deal, but more careful, not the way that Israel could be against, but the Gulf states feel marginalized in that kind of context. So having a peace treaty with Israel is considered good political risk insurance in the U.S. Congress, no matter who wins. That here's something that's bipartisan. Maybe that Trump and Biden can't agree if it's daylight or nighttime outside, but peace between Israel and the Arabs is still a bipartisan consensus issue, and it's recognized as such by these Arab countries. And that gives me some hope that this Emirati deal will have some follow-on by the others. But I do think that being that they're one of the wealthiest Arab states, and they don't have some of the more complications, if you want to use that word, as you have in Saudi Arabia, with their Wahhabism and the ulama, the religious establishment, that maybe there will be some follow-on effects with other countries. But this is a windfall for the state of Israel.
Well, thank you, David. So we've talked about Israel, we've talked about the UAE, and we've talked about the US a little bit. I'd like to now actually talk about the Palestinians, as you suggested I may go there. You will, and I want to put it in your framework. You've always been an advocate for small incremental steps to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You called it going for the base hit, not the home run.
That's right. You know my language.
That's right. Do you see this as a base hit? In other words, does this agreement do anything to advance Middle East peace incrementally?
Look, what has to happen, really, Lisa, I'm glad you asked, because what there needs to be is a rethink of the classic paradigm that came out in 2003 of the Arab Peace Initiative. They went like this, essentially. We're going to help the Palestinians leverage their case when it comes to Israel by saying we don't do a thing with Israel until the Palestinians get their terms. What's changed in 2003 is the region itself. There was no ISIS in 2003. The Iranians didn't have the influence in 2003 that they have today. A lot of these extremist groups have been able to grow. And so these Arab states are saying, wait a second, what are we doing exactly? We're putting ourselves on hold for one generation, maybe 2 generations, until the Palestinians get what they want. But we have our own interests with Israel. So instead of viewing the Middle East as a static place that's kind of frozen, as if it's the Arctic Circle, and we could just put everything on hold for 2 or 3 generations, now they're saying is we don't want to wait anymore. And here, I think that's good. And instead of, like I said, the Palestinians cursing the Emiratis, I think they should say is, wait a second, they have $1 trillion in a sovereign wealth funds. They could do so much on the economic side of the West Bank. We should use them and not be against them. But it requires a classic rethink of the old paradigm, which is Palestinians first, Arab states, end of the line. And I don't think the Arab states are willing to wait anymore. So instead of saying, oh, it shouldn't be this way, it's not fair, we should think of how to be creative out of the box and try to find ways to get the Emirati, and I think they want to, too. That's the irony. The Emirates have had a very cold relationship with the Palestinians for several years now. It's not because of last Thursday. It predates it by years. Why? Because the rival to President Abbas of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, his rival is a guy by the name Mohammed Dahlan. And the fact that the Crown Prince, MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed, is hosting Dahlan, Abbas saw it as an affront to him. And so there's been a frostiness here. So we should think of that they gotta thaw their own relationship basically, and think about how they can help. These talks have been stalled. Abbas and Netanyahu have not met each other since 2010. So I think this is the best news in years. And now that we need creative thinking of how to get the Emirates to help them jumpstart these stalled talks. So I don't think it's, I think I see the good side here. I think this is a chance that we didn't have. You could be stuck in 2003 with the old paradigm, or you could say the old paradigm wasn't working. We have to update that paradigm, and we should see by having more relations with Israel and the Arab states, how they could bring their resources to bear to help bridge some of these differences. And some of the differences are economic. So I see them, this is not a bypass road. I see it as a bridge.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So I'm going to open up now, and I invite both Dennis and David to just jump in with your answers. And these questions are coming from the viewers. And one of the questions that came up often had to do with the issue of annexation or extension of sovereignty, however you refer to it. Many people have asked whether Netanyahu was sincere in seeking to change the legal status of parts of the West Bank, or whether it was part of diplomatic maneuvering. And you referred, David, to Ayelet Shaked's comment about embracing the UAE agreement. She also said on the news Friday night in Israel that she thought that annexation was off the table the moment that a national unity government was formed and Yamina was sent to the opposition. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on whether you thought Israel was ever really headed down the path of sovereignty extension.
I'll start with that. The answer is absolutely. Prime Minister Netanyahu may have initially used it for political purposes before the 3 elections, because he kept repeating it. He used to be a singular voice in public against it. When he had during the Obama administration, he was consistently against it, and he used the Obama administration as an argument with the right to say we can't do it. But with Trump and the Trump plan, he saw what I think in his mind was a historic opportunity. I often tell the story that when I was negotiating the Hebron Accord with him, we were sitting alone in his office one night around midnight, and out of the blue, he said, "I'm going to do what Ben Gurion did." And I reacted almost reflexively because obviously he's a product of the revisionist movement. So I said, "Well, you mean Begin?" And he said, No. I'm going to do what Ben Gurion did. He did the big stuff. And I think that Netanyahu saw with the Trump plan the opportunity to do two things. One, change the baseline, meaning the whole world looked at the baseline as June 467 when it came to borders. Yes, it evolved to June 467 and mutually agreed swaps. And that means by definition, June 467 can't be the default border because it's and the settlement blocks. But the reality is for him, that was still the wrong baseline. And he thought if he could annex and the US recognized it, others internationally would have to come to adjust to that. And he would create this new reality for Israel on the one hand, and on the other, he would be setting Israel's eastern border. And that would be a historic achievement. And I think he saw that, especially as someone who's now bears a stigma of being the only sitting prime minister who's ever been indicted, this became a counterpoint for him in terms of his legacy. So I think he was absolutely convinced. And I can tell you, the people closest to him were very actively also campaigning here to prepare the ground, to argue that this should be done. This was not a tactical move. Now, what happened was he was put in a position where he couldn't proceed because the reality is as he has said publicly, he could not proceed over an American no. If he does this and nobody recognizes it, the US doesn't recognize it, then his own argument that others will adjust is an illusion. So he knew he didn't have, once it became clear that he wasn't going to get a yes. And for several months, he was getting a blinking yellowy light from the administration. He wasn't getting a red light. So he still thought he had a chance. But the combination of the time being slowed down and then COVID, it took it off. It required him to stop talking about it because the attention had to be on COVID. This was something that he wanted, but he adjusted. He adjusted to the reality, and he wants to take advantage of what is the moment. And I want to pick up on something that David was saying before. You know, the UAE will do things with Israel now because it's in Israel's interest. And the UAE was sending a message basically to the Palestinians. We're not going to wait for you forever. You know, if you want to stand pat, David talks about a freeze in the region. And the region, of course, itself isn't frozen. It's not frozen because of other threats. But think about the post-COVID environment, assuming we get to it. The economic consequences are unfortunately going to be very dramatic and very negative for a lot of the Arab states. They're going to need help on a lot of issues. The combination of that and what's happening with drought as related to climate change creates an acute problem for water. Well, there's one country in the region that has solved the water problem. There's one country in the region that has developed drought-resistant crops. There's one country in the region that has now developed a technique to grow wheat and rice, which are normally very high-consuming water plants. They've now developed the ability to grow wheat and rice with a fraction of the water that used to be required. So from the standpoint of water or agriculture or cyber or other high-tech startups, health, all these factors are such that Israel again becomes more attractive. So in effect, the message to the Palestinians is, you want to stand pat, you're going to see the rest of the region doesn't wait for you. I don't think we're going to see Bahrain and Oman immediately follow. Partly because I want to see how the dust settles. Partly because in the case of Bahrain, they have the majority population is a Shia population. And Iran will try to exploit that. So I'm not sure they're going to rush to it. Doesn't mean they won't do it. But it means right now they're going to want to see how's this working out for the UAE. And if they have the sense that it's working out well for the UAE, both economically, but also with the US, then you're going to see others, I think, follow suit. And there's already a reality with the Palestinians. I am in touch with a number of Palestinians, including some who are part of the PA. And one of them said to me, you realize right now we're a minority within the Arab League? The Palestinian Authority went to the Arab League and said you have to condemn the Emiratis. they went to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, 57 Muslim majority countries. They asked both of them condemn the Emiratis. They were rebuffed in both cases. Now that message becomes even more powerful because they're being told, you don't have a veto power. And if you don't have a veto power, this gets to David's point about you really got to think differently. If the Palestinians don't have a veto power, what they should be doing is thinking, how can we take advantage of this? Think about the following. The UAE made the issue of annexation a condition for normalizing, which means they did something for the Palestinians as they normalized. The message for others could be, okay, you don't have to fully normalize, but maybe you say to the Israelis, look, we'll take a step. Maybe we won't fully normalize, but we'll take a step. We'll send officials to Israel for conversations, not just in our country, but to Israel. But here's what we want, because as we take steps towards you, we also want to see you ease conditions on the Palestinians. If the Palestinians were thinking about how to take advantage of this as opposed to how to once again show they're defiant, they could in fact advance. My fear is right now, Abu Mazen is very stuck in his ways. Everyone around him is competing to position themselves for succession. And that means reinforcing the traditional narrative of being defiant. But the problem is, increasingly, it means standing alone. One last thing, and then I'll stop. The Palestinians I'm talking to, what came through in the conversations, they don't know what to do. They know right now they can't affect the leadership, but they don't know what to do. And that too creates a kind of interesting possibility, because one can begin talking to Palestinians and giving them, here are some options for you. It's clear right now they're not going to initiate anything. And the UAE won't do more with them, because the more they criticize the UAE, the more they give them an incentive to say, look, we did something for you, you don't like it, you're on your own. So we're in a period where I think others will follow suit. It may not be immediate, and the Palestinians need to learn the lessons from it. And let's hope that those who are friends of the Palestinians will encourage them to recognize what is the new reality in the region, and that's the point. We didn't just cross the threshold here. There is a new reality in the region. It reflects something David said before. We've known for some time that there's a strategic convergence of interest between Israel and all the Sunni Arab leaderships. As you begin to normalize, you have the potential to show the benefits. You have the potential not just to have the leaderships who see the benefit, but their publics as well.
Exactly. Can I just say something, Lisa, on the Netanyahu question you asked?
Of course.
I would say, look, when the history book is written on this, the history is written, on one hand, this Prime Minister Netanyahu is a person, again, whether you like him or you don't like him, he's a person of, I think, he's usually a strategic thinker on many issues. And he has a lot of points he could point to with Israel's infrastructure and its landscape, and the whole high-tech landscape. So, but I think on the Palestinian issue, if you had him in a room over a martini, he would probably agree he has not conditioned the landscape politically for why Israel needs to move forward. And I have all these maps, which I don't want to go through. I don't want to take up the time so we get to more questions. But I think when the history is written, people might ask the following question. At the end, the White House wanted to compromise with you on annexation. And all they asked you for was for compensation, so it would not look to the Arab world or to the Europeans or maybe even to Americans that it was unilateral, because unilateralism sounds harsh. So you take a little annexation, but then you give offsetting area to the Palestinian. So in the West Bank, it's called Area C. It has to do with the land classification. I don't want to get into all this now, but all they wanted was some sort of an offset. If Israel annexes 6%, it yields 6%. I think the prime minister in this case, he never was able to tell his right wing, the settlers, something very basic, which is our ability to try to get anything close to 30% of the West Bank is that we agree to a Palestinian state of 70%. This is not a favor to them. We want to be a Jewish and democratic state. We don't want a one-state solution because the DNA of America is one person, one vote. our centrism is what is going to maintain American support for Israel for generations. All we need is, to understand the danger of a binational state, of a one-state solution. He didn't really do that. And when it came down to it, the settlers said, hey, we're for the annexing 30%, but what is this giving 70% part, to a Palestinian state? And the administration's view is this is not, and I think Dennis pointed out in his early initial remarks, this is not an annexation plan, it's a holistic peace plan. And I think the failure to make that case, suddenly the Trump plan was attacked from the Israeli right, from the settlers. And Netanyahu felt he had no kind of political space to maneuver to cut this deal. And the failure to cut that deal, frankly, is what led to the Emirati-Israeli breakthrough. In other words, for the viewer at home, whether in Orange County, New York, wherever you are, somewhere in the middle, think of 2020 as something where the key players in January never thought they'd be at this point in August. You had the Trump plan, as Dennis pointed out. Then that kind of failed, and there was the annexation idea, which hit against fierce resistance. And when that hit a wall, because there was a standoff between the White House and Netanyahu over this issue of a compensation, don't make it unilateral. Let us be able to make it a package deal so we can show everyone there's something in it for them. The failure to reach that compromise is what led to this, third development, which I think is the biggest development and the most welcome development. So kind of history works in interesting ways, but I think there should be some self-reflection among the settler movement that by moving Netanyahu over to the right, as Dennis pointed out correctly, Netanyahu used to be against the annexation because he understood how this would play into that dynamic. As he became more dependent on the right, and we haven't really talked about his trial, where he's more dependent on the right, being in the political bunker with him, he moved towards them in many ways, but he didn't tell them that in order to get what you want, we've got to give others what they want. And as someone in the White House said, this isn't just about taking, it's about giving. So it's a two-way street. I think in the end, it all worked out for the best because it led to a result that is a real windfall for the United States, for Israel, and the United Arab Emirates. And I hope that the Palestinians get over their shock, I believe, for them. And I think the American Jewish community should be thrilled that here you've got some good news that's really a win-win-win that has a lot of possibilities.
Thank you, David. I'm going to go to the next question now because a lot of people are asking about the issue of the F-35s, which we touched on briefly and we talked about before. Can you address the issue of selling the F-35s to the UAE? We noted that Israel has said they're opposed to it, but it's a non-public part of the deal. But is it a non-public part of the deal that Israel just wants to be seen opposing in public? And if the F-35 is sold to the UAE, how does it affect Israel's qualitative military edge?
So let me take this in different pieces. Number one, was it a part of the deal? Absolutely. If this, from the UAE standpoint, yes, they were offering normalization. In a sense, the UAE mindset was the following. Okay, Israel will get normalization when we do this. The Trump administration will get a win. And what exactly do we get? We get our security needs addressed. We get something that we've wanted for some time, meaning access to advanced UAV, advanced drones, which are actually not just surveillance, but actually strike. These are drones that have the ability to carry out missile strikes. And they've wanted the F-35 for some time. Now, so any notion that this wasn't part of the deal ignores that this is, in fact, this was a condition for the UAE. Now, it's quite true, I'm sure, that the UAE didn't say to the Israelis, it's because from their standpoint, it's a US UAE issue. I do find it, I will say, it seems, I would be surprised, but I guess I shouldn't be surprised necessarily, that the administration wouldn't share that with the Israelis as this was part of the deal. To be honest, my sense is this is one of those cases where you don't ask a question because you don't want to hear the answer. And my guess is there was a kind of agreement that they wouldn't discuss certain things, and that would provide plausible deniability. So that just sort of explains, I think, the reality of that. But now let's take a closer look at the F-35 and the qualitative military edge. Even if there's a decision made to provide the UAE F-35s, the reality is we're talking about at least 5 to 6 years before they would become available, because there's a limited production line. There are others who are in line ahead of that. So it's not something that the UAE would get very soon. Advanced drones, yes, that they could get much sooner. I don't think the Israelis have a problem with advanced drones. In fact, in the past, it was the US that limited the Israelis from transferring some of that technology because we had concerns about the proliferation of that technology. So I don't think that's the problem. The issue is the F-35. But if you're talking about, first of all, what's a pretty long time horizon, number one. Number two, recognize when you talk about that, that means between now and then, there will be adjustments to it. One thing about Israel, Israel has made adjustment to every weapon system we have provided it. And by the way, it creates a kind of effect back on us, because Israel's experience with weapons, where they actually have to use them, has allowed them to modify weapon systems, and we then incorporate the modifications into our own weapons that we use for ourselves. So there really is a kind of symbiotic relationship here that we may provide to Israel, but we gain from Israel. So I would put this in the perspective of, look, will the Israeli military establishment be doing handstands over this? No, but part of that is they weren't told about it. You know, if they'd been told about it, I'm not sure they would have been against it. My guess is they would have come back with some suggestions about how to protect Israel in light of that. You know, advanced weapons have been sold to Arab countries, those who have peace with Israel, those who don't have peace with Israel. And obviously, you know, I've been part of these discussions about, okay, let's discuss how you see this particular weapon affecting the QME, the qualitative military edge. And then in those discussions, we figure out, all right, what can be done to limit the effect that you're concerned about? And that's almost certainly what would have happened had the defense ministry been told and the military had been told. They would have said, okay, we want peace there. We don't want it. We're not going to block it. But here are the concerns we have, and this is the kind of conversation we would like to have with the administration to be sure our concerns get addressed. Now, obviously, if the planes aren't going to be delivered for something like 5 or 6 years, you have time for that discussion.
I would just add on this again is that there's a history here. And like I said, with Egypt and Jordan, they also got American aircraft. But, and the peace with Egypt is held for 40 years. This aircraft has never been used against Israel. In the case of the UAE, they never have ever fought Israel, ever. And they certainly now are making peace with Israel. What usually is done to settle these compromises in the past that Dennis is alluding to, I think, is that the Israeli defense people get their say and say, well, you know, this avionics package that's part of the F-16 or part of the F-35. Well, what about strip those kinds of packages out? I'm not an avionics expert, so I want to be humble about this. But all I'm saying is Israel has been always very, not just smart, but wise on how to say, you know, if it's done in a certain way, you know, we don't have to worry about it. Now, and I'm sure in this case, QME, Qualitative Military Edge, is a congressional law, and an arms sale needs congressional approval. I think it's fair to say for people who are concerned, and I'm very sympathetic with that, and Dennis and I come from the Washington Institute. We take Israeli security extremely seriously. We just had the chief of staff of the IDF, of the Israeli Defense Forces, our fellow for half a year right before COVID. And I can tell you we take it extremely seriously. And my view here is that the defense establishment will find a way to, you know, worry about, you know, getting a result. Everyone wants this treaty. Nobody wants this treaty to be waylaid in any way. So I think they're going to work it out. And whether it's this avionics package in and that avionics package out, I think they'll work it out. But the fact that Congress is going to want to hear from experts, and that includes Israeli experts, The new Director General of the Israeli Defense Ministry was the head of the Air Force until recently. So he's going to have special say. Amir Eshel, really serious guy. He's someone who's known very well to Dennis and myself. And he is standing on the Hill with key members of Congress. So I tend to think this will sort itself out. And, you know, people should be relaxed about this, because this is not the first time we hear about QME. So I'm hopeful that this will be sorted out in a good way.
Let me just add one point to what David said about Amir Eshel. At the beginning of the Obama administration, there was a need to restore the discussion, the dialogue on the QME. There was a tension between the George W. Bush administration, notwithstanding how strong a supporter of Israel George W. Bush was. There was anger within the Pentagon over Israeli transfers to the Chinese. And it basically blunted conversations about QME implications, even though there were sales going to the Arabs. So when the Obama administration came in, there was a decision made to restore the QME discussion. And I was part of that. And the fact is, who was the person who led the discussion on the Israeli side? Amir Eshel. Amir Eshel knows this issue inside and out. Amir Eshel has a long history discussing it with his American counterparts, and he has an extremely good reputation throughout the whole national security establishment, as David said, as also on the Congress. So you have, in many respects, the perfect person to be managing that discussion from the Israeli side.
Terrific. Well, thank you. You know, we could go on, I know, for another hour or two. It's always wonderful and fascinating to learn from the two of you, but I'm afraid we've come to the top of the hour. So I want to just say to both of you, Ambassador Ross and David, we are so grateful for your time and your insights, and we look forward to following the developments on this issue. Before we close, just a couple of short things. I want to say a special thank you to the staff at JFNA and Jewish Federation of Orange County for their tremendous help with today's webinar, and thanks to everybody who participated. Thank you to everybody. Thank you to our scholars. Thank you, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.